welcome all. It's lovely to see you, even if it's only in a couple of inches of screen. We've been hanging on for months, hoping that we'd be able to get back to Maldon Mill, but obviously that's not going to be possible for another several months, I suspect. And so we bullied Tim into this, rather. Actually, he was silly enough to say he had a kind of talk up his sleeve, and he was immediately pounced on and signed up for tonight. So we're very grateful to Tim for agreeing to do this. And equally, I've been bullying our president. So assuming that all goes well tonight, Lee Prosser is going to be talking to us sometime in early December about the roofs of Hampton Court Palace, which is something to look forward to, I hope. Tonight's talk, as you'll hear, is on the several historic houses around the Maldon area, which of course Tim knows extremely well, so I'm looking forward to that. I no longer have to give you all the instructions about the chat and everything, because we've had that already several times over. So you don't want to listen to me. I shall hand over to Tim and let him get on with the talk. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Martin. Right, well, I better try and share my screen. Application window. Right. Hopefully you can see my presentation. Martin, can you see it?
Yes. Yeah.
Good. That's great. Well, as Martin explained, I hadn't planned to give a talk to the group this year, but the committee kindly nominated me to be their guinea pig for the experiment using Zoom. Obviously, it's a shame not to be able to have a meeting at Maldon Mill, which are always extremely interactive, and that's what makes them so fun. I find generally that talks take a lot longer to give than I initially planned, because people, certain members who will remain nameless, like to interject with comments such as, no, that dates from the 15th century, or that's an oriel window and not a bay window, and such things. But you can bombard me with questions at the end. It's slightly strange talking to a silent audience. So this is I didn't have a talk prepared. It's a slightly random, and I don't have any notes, so it might be slightly rambling, and I apologize for that. But the buildings are interesting. I've chosen 4 buildings that I've not shown to the group before. They're all buildings that I've worked on the past couple of years. Some are still ongoing projects. So the first 3 houses are multi-phased timber-framed buildings. And I'm going to explain how, by studying these buildings while they've undergone repair work recently, we've reached a better understanding of them and how they've evolved over time. And then the final case study is something slightly different. It's a younger building. It's a Victorian development of cottages with its own very interesting history and unique set of conservation challenges. So anyway, without further ado, this is my first case study. This is numbers 13, 15 and 17 Silver Street in Maldon, in the conservation area. It's a grade 2 listed building. And looking at it from the outside, it's all very Georgian in style and theme. You've got multi-paned vertically sliding sash windows and classically themed front door surrounds, all apparently dating from the early 19th century. But there are clues to the fact that the building is actually much older, in the way, for instance, that the sash windows between the different properties are at different levels, and the way that the outer 2 houses project forward of the central one. And that is because, I'll change the slide. Hang on a minute. Good. Finally, the slide has changed. That is because this building started as a medieval building, and it's been disguised by beautification in the Georgian period. So it was a substantial medieval house with 2 cross wings either side of an open hall. I'm going to try and put a pointer on. Yes, the right hand cross wing is I think the low end service wing, and there are not many features which allow us to date it very accurately. It's got relatively wide stud spacing, and mainly on that basis I'm guessing that maybe it's early 15th century. The other cross wing is much larger. It's got more closely spaced studs. It's got stud to stud tension bracing, which is typical of Colchester, Maldon and Coggeshall. It's got a crown post roof with very thin braces. It probably dates around 1500, but it's hard to be accurate. But this was the high-end parlour crosswing. The open hall has been completely rebuilt, but there's one piece of evidence which tells us the height of the front wall of the hall, and you can see that within the front first floor room of this crosswing. So the next, so there's a more finished drawing of the house as it may have once appeared. But yes, the next photograph is taken within this front first floor room of this crosswing, where this stud here has got a bit of a notch cut out of it, which I took to be the housing for the wall plate at the front of the hall, so that the eaves level. And when they picked away some of the modern plasterboard infill, you could actually feel behind the studs, and I could feel that above the roof line the timbers were heavily weathered because they've been exposed for a long time, but below this, in this area, the timbers are all unweathered and smooth. So that confirmed my theory that was housing for the front wall plate. This is my isometric reconstruction of that high-end crosswing. So the current owner is very gradually repairing this, and that's involved stripping away some layers of plaster in order to get to the structure to repair it. And as he's done that, that's revealed more evidence of the design of the building. And actually this drawing I did fairly early on, and I need to add to it because he's uncovered more evidence. So basically it's a 2.5 bay crosswing with 2 rooms on both floors. These are my interpretive floor plans as the layout would have been when first built. So we've been able to work out where some of the original doorways were, where we can see where the door was leading from the hall into the crosswing. We can see that the 2 ground floor rooms were connected by a doorway at the hall end of the internal partition. And interestingly, there's a door leading from the sort of rear end of the crosswing into a yard at the back. I haven't come across a door in that position before, so it's slightly unusual. Don't know exactly where the stairs were, except that they had to be in the rear room. The floor joists in the front room are more or less intact, and there's no stair trap there. But the floor joist in the rear room, the first floor structure in the rear room, has all been rebuilt. So we can't tell exactly where the stairs were, but it must have been in there somewhere. Initially, I had thought that maybe there was an external stair tower going up there, but when they opened up the structure, we found that there were studs there, which disproved that theory. This is for the benefit of people, those of you in the audience who don't spend your time interpreting timber framed buildings. This is not a very good slide, but just to illustrate the sort of evidence for windows that have been lost. So there's a gap in the stud work. There's no stud here. There's a peg down here for a lost sill. There's the leading edge of diamond-shaped mortises for diamond section mullions, which at this date would have been unglazed, and there's a rectangular groove to the underside of the wall plate, which would have been to house a sliding shutter. And a couple of years ago, I was very excited to clamber up into the loft of this agricultural building in Great Totham and discover these 16th century shutters intact. They're across diamond sectioned mullion windows, and they're not mentioned in the list description. Evidently, the list inspector didn't clamber up into that loft. I don't think the owner even knows that they're there, but they're a very important survival, an indication of the sort of thing that every medieval timber framed house would have had, but which virtually never survive in domestic buildings. Anyway, back to the crosswing in Silver Street. So we're standing in the first floor room, looking at the partition between the two rooms, which, as you can appreciate, has been very altered. And this photograph, I've just sketched over it the evidence for the removed frame. So features such as peg holes show us where studs used to be. So there's a peg there for a brace, and we've got a housing for a brace in that original stud. This fireplace is evidently later. I think it was inserted in the early 17th century, but it's been mullered by these bits of wood that have been planted onto it. And there was evidently a door at this end because we've got no peg for a stud there. And the ceiling at the top of the photograph is a later insertion. And if we clamber up through the loft hatch, this is what we see. So we've got a crown post with a very, very skinny brace, which seem to get thinner through time, and that's a very typical sort of early 16th century thing. And this roof space is very typical of Maldon. We find that from the late 16th century or early 17th century, as glazing is installed in the windows, and chimney stacks are more chimney stacks are inserted, and the buildings get better heated. At that date, they tend to apply lath and plaster to the underside of the rafters and up to the collar, and on the underside of the collar. And then the timbers that remain visible, more often than not, were painted a colour. So in this case, you've got a sort of grey black on those studs and on the collar purlin and on the brace. And the infill panels would originally have been white. And you can see that down here, the grey or black paint has overlapped the edge of the stud onto the infill panel. So when it was originally done, it would have given the impression of the studs being slightly wider and perhaps straighter edged than they might be in reality. The next photograph is the close-up at the top of this infill panel, where I noticed that there were the traces of an arched head for sort of an arcading feature. There are also traces of very faint traces of yellow paint. And we found similar traces of paint on timbers throughout this crosswing. And the owner is very enthusiastic about the history of the building, and he was persuaded to consult Andrea Kirkham, a specialist in this period of internal decoration and a paint conservator. And so she came and took lots of little paint samples and had them analysed under a microscope, and that enabled her to work out the various layers of paint and the sequences of painted decoration. So the next few slides are highly conjectural sort of mock-ups of what that wall in that first floor room may have looked like. Conjectural because we don't know quite how extensive the paint was. So early in the 16th century, shortly after being built, the studs were all unpainted, and so you would have had the bare oak. And then probably in the early 17th century, they inserted lath and plaster ceilings to the underside of the rafters, improving thermal efficiency. And then they picked out the exposed timbers in black. And as I say, this is almost certainly incorrect. It's highly conjectural because all the paint has been cleaned off at this level. But it's safe to assume that the colour that the timbers were painted in the attic is the same as down here because it was all one room. And we don't know how extensive this arcading was. In all likelihood, it was between all of the timbers. So there were 2 phases of black, and then all the timbers were painted yellow. And then later, all the timbers were painted brown. And then there are a few layers of lime wash before, in the 18th century, perhaps around the mid 18th century, they inserted a lower ceiling, which is currently in place just above the apex of the tie beam. So it's a really clear, I think, fascinating sequence of painted decoration throughout the 17th century. And it's just the sort of thing that's very easily missed, but it gives a real insight into what the interior of this house looked like throughout the 17th century. And there's also very important evidence for 18th century wall finishes in the building. This is the thing that Andrea was most excited about this house. In the rear first floor room, at the bottom of the back wall, Andrea spotted this small bit of fabric. It's a fragmentary remains of a textile or fabric wall hanging. It would have been it's trapped behind a skirting at the bottom of the wall. It appears to be green, and we know from documentary sources that textile hangings were a thing, were quite common in the 18th century, but I've certainly never seen anything like that, and it's an important survival, even though it's only a tiny piece. And in the front ground floor room of the cross wing, we found this 18th century panelling, which had been rather brutally plasterboarded over in not too distant past. And in doing so, they'd removed the moulded dado rail and the skirting, although it survived. Those features survived on other sections of the panelling. And behind the panelling, incidentally, we could see the studs had the yellow and black paint schemes on. And Andrea also took paint samples from this panelling because the owner is very keen on restoring it and he wants to paint it an authentic colour. And basically, the earliest paint schemes were a stone sort of buff off-white colour, but with the skirting picked out in a chocolate brown. And then at the other end of the room, it was altered in the early 19th century with the formation of these alcoves and this fireplace, which is very typically late 18th, early 19th century, in the use of sort of reeded surrounds with, in the corners, you get those squares with those roundel devices, a very early 19th century sort of thing. And around that time, a partition was installed at the side of this room, which would have created a side passage, because it's at that date that I think the 3 parts of the medieval house were subdivided to create 3 houses. And this house, number 13, would have become like a side house with a side passage plan, which brings us back to the outside, which is, in the early 19th century when they underbuilt the jetties and applied all these sash windows, and it acquired its appearance as it is now. And I think it's a really interesting case study in terms of how the house has evolved over time. And it's been said that there's no such thing as a medieval house, which is a slightly silly thing to say, because obviously there is such a thing as a medieval house, but it's true in the sense that all medieval houses that survive tend to be very fragmentary, and they're actually houses that have evolved over time. And the way that they've changed over time is part of what makes them interesting. And this house in particular, I think, is interesting because of the sequence of internal decoration that we've unpicked. And it's one that Andrea and I really ought to publish. So the next case study is a rural one. It's another multi-phased house. This is in Cold Norton, It's called Delatches. And so looking at the front, you've got a brick facade with a relatively regular arrangement of windows, but in this photograph you can see that there's earlier things going on with this exposed timber framing around the back. The earliest part of the house is about here, where that bay window is. In that position there is probably 15th century parlour crosswing, still with unglazed diamond mullion windows. The jetty bressumer on the inside has got a lovely foliate painted scheme on, which I assume is early 17th century or something like that. The open hall that would have been contemporary with that wing has been lost, but in the mid 16th century it was replaced by a 2-storey hall and service range. I've drawn it long jettied, but I've since realised that it probably wasn't long jettied and it was just flat fronted, but it was definitely 2-storied. It has a crown post roof still, and the service end has been lost, but you could see inside evidence for a pair of conventional service doorways and a third one leading to the stair. And then I think probably in around the third quarter of the 16th century, the parlour crosswing was extended to the rear, which that wing was jettied to the rear and heated from the outset by a flank chimney stack. And then around 1600, there's another wing added at right angles to the 2 parlour wings, which has this rather curious form. It's quite very narrow. I'm not sure exactly what that is, whether it was presumed just to provide another bedroom and another ground floor room. And in the corner, the angle between the rear parlour range and the hall, in the late 17th century, a stair tower was added. And then, probably in the mid to late 18th century, they applied this brick facade and took the gable off the crosswing, and it had a hipped roof applied. And some of the windows at first floor are original 18th century lead glazed casement windows, and quite a rare and precious survival. At this end, this is actually a 1960s extension, done rather well in that the brickwork matches very closely the 18th century brickwork, but it's on the site of the lost 16th century service range. But the part of the building that I've looked at in most detail and that I want to talk to you about now are these 2 parlour extensions, these 2 amazing Elizabethan wings at the back of the house, because the current owner, when he bought it a couple of years ago, needed to make some repairs to the timber frame, which included removing render from this range, and we now know that it looked like that. So it was originally jettied, but unfortunately they've, in the 18th century, cut back the jettied projection. But fortunately for us, they've reused the original tie beam in the recessed position, and that tie beam has the evidence to sort of reconstruct on paper what the fenestration and studwork was like. And as I say, it's probably built around the third quarter of the 16th century, around the time that glass was becoming cheaper and more widely available. And it's that period in which they go slightly mad with glazing, with these amazing clear story windows which wrap around both corners with these central feature oriel windows. I could see mortises for those in the jetty plate and in the tie beam. And this wing faces south, so it must have been flooded in light with light, and it must have been a very striking contrast to the interior of the house in the medieval period. And then this very curious narrow wing at right angles to the other ones, I think was added around 1600. It's got these very striking serpentine braces, and we find in Essex they come in around the sort of late 16th century. The two wings have different moulding profiles to the window mullions. So on the earlier wing, the window mullions have OGs and Boutels, and that sort of type of moulding you tend to find on 16th century window mullions. I was looking at David and Barbara Martin's book on windows in the Sussex Weald, and there were several examples that looked sort of similar to this, dating from the 1560s and 70s. And the mullion to I'm thinking circa 1600 range is sort of a hybrid between the earlier type with a Bautel moulding inside, but on the outside it's got the sort of later form, the ovolo, which we find in Essex comes in at the end of the 16th century and then is the window mullion profile that everyone uses in throughout the first half of the 17th century. I think the next slide just shows you in the roof space of this wing, and it shows that when they cut that the jettied projection off, they also changed the roof to a side purlin roof, probably in the 18th century, about the same time they added to the brick facade. And originally it was a collar rafter roof. I don't know for certain whether, well, we don't know whether it had a crown post at that date or not. But you'll notice that below the level of the collars are the shadows of lath and plaster. So I had a lath and plaster ceiling, just like we saw at 13 Silver Street. And I think some of these studs have been reused from the gable that was formerly projecting, and you can see that there's black on them. So there was probably a plain scheme in this wing, just like at Silver Street. Moving on to conservation, this was what the rear wing looked like when we had taken off some of the cement. And I think all of the people listening tonight will know that cement is not good for timber frame buildings. It doesn't breathe, it traps the moisture and causes the timbers to rot quite badly. And unfortunately, there are very few timber frame buildings that haven't had cement render applied in the 20th century. But on the outside, the timbers were very decayed, but on the inside, they were in good condition. And so the solution that the carpenters came up with in this instance was to plant new oak onto the outside and preserve the internal face of the timbers. Very skillfully done. And this is the wing following repair. They completely renewed the render with a breathable lime render applied on lath and plaster, which will prevent the timber from decaying. It's all been painted with a chyme mineral paint, which is a very expensive breathable paint. The carpenters have reinstated the braces where there was evidence for them, and they've even gone to the trouble of, the owner didn't want to put back a bay window. He's replaced the French doors, but the carpenters have just reinstated the sill, or parts of the sill of the bay window where there were redundant mortises, just as a sort of nod to that evidence. And they've also carried out some very skillful repairs to that side projecting wing. So looking inside the rear wing before, the windows are all and doors are all modern 20th century, but these two windows occupy the original openings of the clear story windows. There was one window in this wing which retained its original moulded mullions, although they're quite mutilated, unfortunately. Originally, the window would have had stiffening bars, as you'd expect, very probably diamond section thin bars that were used to stabilize the very flimsy late 16th century lead glass, but those have been taken out. The carpenters had several attempts at measuring the mullions, and the first attempts looked nothing like the profile. So I made them look at it very carefully, and they produced this very accurate drawing of the window profile. So obviously this is the outside where the lead glass was applied. And what they did was they had that moulding profile replicated with new mullions, which I think look absolutely beautiful, the way the sun catches them like that. I couldn't persuade the owner to reinstate the stiffening bars, but you don't really need it with lead glazing now. It's much stronger. So that's what that window looks like now, with its restored late 16th century style window, and 2 clear story windows on the corner before the lead glazing has gone in. I love the way the light catches these mullions. And that's in its restored state. And the carpenters even gave me a little offcut of one of the mullions, which is very pleasing to hold during difficult phone calls. So yeah, before and as it is now. So what started off as a fairly straightforward repair job turned into something a little bit more special, very interesting restoration job. And in fact, this repair project was awarded the Building Conservation Award in our Conservation and Design Award scheme last year. The 2 carpenters are Toby Slater and Stan Chippett, and they're great. They're just really enthusiastic and passionate about old buildings and doing interesting things and sensitive things with them. And in fact, they were employed on this project as well, which is the next case study, and we're back in Silver Street. We're directly opposite number 13, which you can see in the distance, and I'm standing on Cromwell Hill, which leads off Silver Street and joins up with Market Hill. And what we're looking at is an 18th century house with a late 16th century range at the back. And unlike the previous 2 case studies, rather than just applying a facade in the Georgian period, in this case, they've replaced the medieval house entirely with a new one. So it was a couple of years ago now, they stripped the render off this structure. Again, horrible cement render, which had caused problems, and they wanted to repair the structure and put a breathable lime render back. This is a very interesting little service wing, which internally it had 2 rooms at ground floor with a partition here. So 1 big room and 1 quite narrow one. And there's an attic floor just below the eaves, which was for a single room. You've got an internal S-shaped brace. So again, I mentioned with Delatches, those sort of SOG shaped braces seem to be a late 16th century thing. And also at that period, braces begin to be put inside the building, as is the case here. So this may be late 16th century or very early 17th century. The framing is still intended to be exposed. But I think the most remarkable thing about this elevation is the evidence for very wide window. So you've got the window head there and the truncated remains of the sill, which ties up with redundant peg and mortise there. So it would originally have looked like that. And this is the head of the window, which was removed to enable them to repair it. It shows the moulding profile of the window mullion, which I suppose was like a diamond section mullion that they've taken all the corners off, they've flattened them, and it's also rebaited for glazing. So I haven't actually come across that type of moulding profile on a mullion before. So that was quite interesting. The other interesting thing that I recorded was there was 1 wall remaining, or the fragment of 1 wall of the medieval house, which this 18th century range replaced, and this late 16th century range was an extension onto. And feeling the timbers in here, they were very weathered, suggesting that the medieval building had been there, presumably medieval building had been there for quite a long time before this range was added. And there was clear evidence that the structure was jettied out over Cromwell Hill. So there was a mortise for a jetty bracket on this post, and there was a fragment of a jetty plate. We can't really deduce much about the design of that medieval building because so little of it survives. All we know is that it was jettied over Cromwell Hill. And I quite often find just single walls of medieval buildings surviving, but it's worth recording them where we notice them. And these are my survey drawings. So I've color coded the different phases of framing. So the late 16th century bit is in blue. That fragment of the medieval house is in purple, and then the 18th century part I've coloured in green. And we actually have documentary evidence for when the 18th century part was built, thanks to the local historian John Smith. It was built in 1741, and it replaced a row of 3 houses. And I can't help but wonder whether that was a medieval house that had been subdivided into 3, like the house opposite, along the lines of the hall, parlour, and service wing. But yeah, that's pure speculation. We don't know. The timber frame of the 1741 range, it's got an oak sole plate, but these big long timbers are imported pine, and we know that pine was being imported to Maldon in the 18th century. But the common studs and braces are mostly recycled oak. And inside the house, there are features consistent with 1741 date, such as this lovely staircase with these carved foliate tread ends. There's also seemingly original panelling. And there's also this bit of the rear wall of the 18th century house, which has been encapsulated within a later extension, and it has what may be original plaster with chevron pargeted design, which is the most common design of pargeting I come across in the Maldon district where it survives. But the 18th century house also acquired a brick facade early in the 19th century, which was originally sort of a grey brick, which has been painted, and it also had these wonderful 2-storey bow windows, which sadly were replaced by these flat pairs of sash windows in the 20th century. So that's the last multi-phase timber framed building. Oh no, sorry, that's not the final slide. This is just to show you the timber frame repairs before it was plastered with lath and plaster and a best of lime lime. So they've skillfully scarfed in new sections of oak where necessary, new oak sole plates throughout, and where they were scarfing onto sections of pine, they've used Douglas fir. Which leads me on to my final case study, which is something very different. It's a much younger building. This is Woodfield Cottages in Heybridge. Built in 1873, they are 3 rows of single-storey cottages, each accessed by a shared access track. With each cottage has on the opposite side of the track, it has one of a pair of semi-detached wash houses and then a garden. 41 cottages in total. This photograph shows looking down one of those rows with the cottages on the right and the outhouses on the left. And these cottages are interesting mainly for a couple of reasons. The first is that they were built as workhouses for Bentall's, which was a major industrial company, which was established in Heybridge in the late 18th century and really transformed the parish in the 19th century with warehouses like this being built, which was built in 1863, and several schemes of workers' houses were built throughout the parish. Edward Hammond Bentle, in the 1870s, at the same time that Woodfield Cottages were built, just up the road, he built a mansion for himself called the Towers, sort of in an Italianate style, which sadly was demolished by dynamite in 1960. But this was interesting because it was built using concrete, and Woodfield Cottages were also built of concrete, so that it was it's shuttered concrete, poured concrete with no reinforcement. And not only that, but the roofs were originally flat. So built in 1873 with flat roofs. This is the 1897 OS map, and it shows the cottages annotated as flat tops. And if you go up into the roof of these cottages, you can see the evidence that they were flat roofed. So you've got an original concrete chimney here, which was evidently originally exposed. And interestingly, it was unpainted. All the cottages are now painted, but I think that originally it would have been bare, unpainted concrete, and it would have looked, the terraces would have looked rather like a 1960s or 70s brutalist building. And there's also traces of the flat roofs. It's only about 10 centimeters thick, which was laid over these joists. And you've got splashes of black tar, which was used to help in an effort to try and waterproof the flat roofs. And in researching these cottages, there's a guy locally whose great grandmother lived in these cottages while they still had their flat roofs. And she would recount how when the weather was hot, the tar used to try and seal those roofs would drip through into the cottage. And she said that her family had to move out while these pitched roofs were added in 1918. So this is a section through one of the cottages as it appears now, following the addition of the pitched roof and the raising of the chimneys. And this is a mock-up of what the section would have been like with the flat roofs. And this is an isometric of the cottages. And I'm working on a cutaway drawing showing the layout and the construction of the roof, but I'm afraid I didn't get it finished in time for tonight's talk. So you'll just have to imagine what that looked like. In my research, someone sent me this. So the cottages were listed in 1971, which is a remarkably early listing for buildings this young. And yeah, this is a cutting from the Maldon, Burnham and Maldon Standard, and the designation as listed buildings left some of the owners mystified. Mr. Eddie McRae, who's 73 years old, said, "I fail to see what historical interest they have. Maldon Borough Council can't give a monkey's cuss about them. There's no name on the roadway. People who come down here don't even know where they are." So mixed reception to that designation. There's later on in the piece, it mentions there having been rumours about road widening, and I wonder whether that may have triggered the designation of the cottages to protect them. But what interests me about the photograph in the newspaper article is that in 1971, you can see the cottages were already not perfectly preserved. They were beginning to be altered, but several of them had acquired porches. The one in the distance has had a loft conversion with large flat-roofed dormers, and the photograph in the top right is that house with these rather incongruous flat-roofed dormers and these interesting plastic bay windows. I don't know exactly when the plastic windows went in, but they've had them since for over 20 years. And unfortunately, a lot of the cottages have been very altered, with replacement windows which are of a different shape than the original ones. Some of them have acquired rather ungainly brick porches, and some of them are just frankly in a really dreadful state. And they're quite difficult buildings. There are quite a few sort of enforcement issues, and I actually asked Historic England to review the listing, because if we were going to invest a lot of time in trying to get things right with these cottages, I wanted to be sure that they felt that they do still merit protection. But they emphatically answered that yes, no, they do, they are important, and of course they are important. So what are we going to do to try and improve their fate? Historic England recognise that there are difficulties, and they've offered in principle to help us find ways to improve the situation. So one of the things I'm looking at the moment is I'm drafting what's called a local listed building consent order. So a lot of you will know that any alteration which affects the character of a building requires listed building consent, which is a form of planning permission. And that's needed even for very minor alterations, such as a replacement window. And yet, while the application is free, it takes 2 months to determine. And if you're doing something very minor, like replacing windows, you could end up spending almost as much money on getting architect's plans drawn up. So a local listed building consent order is something where, for a group of buildings where there are repetitive types of alteration, you can grant automatic consent for works if they're done in a certain way. So we're thinking, I've surveyed one of the few original windows. I think there are about 5 cottages which still have their original sliding sash windows, and I've got been talking to local joiners about how we can replicate them and perhaps even incorporate slim profile double glazing, which is very discreet, and windows incorporating that will look infinitely better than a lot of the windows in the cottages. And so if owners can get automatic permission to carry out restorative works, they may be more likely to do it. And also, we're hoping to establish a grant scheme that will make it easier for people to do that. But that's something I'm working on quite a lot at the moment, which is quite interesting. And yes, what to do with these later porches? I mean, they don't look too bad where they're rendered, but where you've got the red brick, they look quite stark, and it may be just rendering them and painting them white will get back a bit of the a bit more uniformity to the terrace. So that's the end of my talk. It's a rather random collection of buildings, but I suppose there were some common themes in terms of painted decoration and different window mullion profiles. You can ask me questions. I don't know if I'll be able to answer them. Martin, are you still there?
I should be now. Can you hear me? Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Tim. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And good to see some Victorian stuff too, as opposed to our usual diet of timber framing. It's nice to have the variety. Just before we get on to questions, I was very remiss at the beginning. I think we have some people tonight joining us who aren't actually members of the EHBG, and I meant to welcome them to the fold, as it were. So apologies if you're still listening and I didn't welcome you. Good to have you along. Okay, brilliant. Has anybody got anything that they're desperate to ask Tim?
No.
No.
There are no questions in the chat. Oh, that makes my life easy.
Yes,
I do find this with.
Yes, there's no chat.
Yeah, I do find this with online presentations. You're talking to a blank screen yourself, and then at the end you get no reaction. I do a lecture every year to Cambridge students, and usually get a lively discussion at the end of it. This year I did it, not a sausage. Yeah. It's something to do with the format, not the quality of your talk, which was brilliant.
Good.
Right.
Someone
wants to be unmuted. If they just ask on chat, I can mute them.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. That was really excellent. And I concur with Jenny about your drawings. Excellent.
Oh, thank you, Terry. Thanks. Glad you enjoyed it.
Can I say something?
Yes. Hi, Sheila. Nice to see you.
Hi. I'm from Historic England, and I've been working closely with Tim on Woodfield cottages, and so I'm really pleased that he was able to work with him, and hopefully we're going to have a conservation area and put some grant funding towards the proposals that he's talking about. But then I think
I didn't know whether I was allowed to mention that or not.
oh, probably not actually, no. So don't say anything to anybody. But so that's the aim of trying to work with them. But it's probably going to be a 20-year project, I think. But I think you managed to get into one of the cottages, and then the virus came, didn't it? So
yeah, I managed to do my survey work just in time before lockdown. Yeah, that delayed things somewhat.
So hopefully we're going to be able to work with it. It's very difficult because there has been so much alteration. It is very, very difficult. But and there's a lot, as Tim said, there's a lot of sort of enforcement work that needs to be done there. But we've seen another example somewhere in Derbyshire where they've spent a long time doing similar sort of thing, and it worked really well. And over a long period of time, people got behind it, and you know, things do look a lot better now, I think. So it's just a question of trying to see the long-term view.
Yeah, well, I'm very grateful for the assistance you've offered so far. You know, it's great.
Yeah. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have said that. So anyway, don't tell anybody else.
If Richard Ellis wants to unmute himself, he can ask his question.
Just click the unmute. Thank you very much, Tim. It was all very interesting.
Yeah, hi, Richard.
There was one particular question that I put on the chat. Usually when these type of projects start, people have what they think is a good understanding about what the building is doing. And quite a lot of that is based upon the listing description. For any of the projects that you've described, were the proposals always remaining the same, or were they changed as a result of anything that was discovered as part of the work?
So I think they've all changed. The first one, there's been no list of building consent application because they're just making repairs so far. And I've just visited to sort of advise on an informal basis. But yeah, your understanding of the building does change during the course of the work. So I try to be as flexible as possible, really. I tend to, sometimes it's better to do a bit of opening up earlier on, because there's nothing worse than drawing up a big, lovely scheme, and then you open the wall up and you find that there's a lovely Tudor door head where you want to, I don't know.
As we know, it's quite easy to have a timber frame building that you think is one particular century, and then to find out that it's 200 years earlier.
Absolutely, that's what makes them so fun. But they're unpredictable, aren't they?
Indeed.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Richard.
There's a thank.
Tim,
Sorry.
could I ask you? We'll make a request.
Yeah.
Could I have a short write-up for the newsletter?
Yeah, I'll work something out. Maybe a write-up about which is one of the buildings.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah.
John Schofield's offered me a long article, he says, for the next newsletter. So I'm looking towards January, February time.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.
We got locked down.
Still very busy working from my shed.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I thought that was an excellent talk.
Yeah.
The graphics were great.
Good, I'm glad.
Could I ask one sort of a basic question? The flat roofed concrete buildings, what was the roof made of? What was the tar going over the top of it?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly, but all I know is it was only about 10 centimeters thick. I don't know whether it was just sort of concrete slabs and then they tried to seal the gaps. Whatever it was, it didn't work very well. All I can see is at the bottom of the chimney, you can just see where it's sort of been broken off. And they tried to sort of seal it with tar.
Are you aware of any other examples that are similar in the region?
No, not of flat roofs of that date.
The obvious
I can't hear you, David.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, the obvious one is Clockhouse Way, Braintree, but that's about the First World War. And that's
right.
concrete blocks, not poured concrete or shuttered concrete, with flat roofs, but by Crittals. There's housing for people returning after the war, and everything inside was made of metal. Metal joists, metal cupboards, because metal was cheaper than timber. But they aren't of course as old as the Bental buildings, and they present. They're mostly in a terrible state, but there is one pair that is listed and has been restored to a degree.
That's interesting. Clockhouse blocks.
Clockhouse Way, yes.
Clockhouse Way. Oh, thanks for that. I'll look into that.
And just to add to that as well, the Clockhouse Way ones are actually built in metric.
Oh.
In what? In Ipswich?
No, they were built in metric measure.
Oh, metric. Yes. 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 The interesting thing about those is that the cement mortar jointing proved more durable than the concrete blocks with a relatively weak mix. And so in some of the buildings, you've got the cement mortar standing proud of the concrete block.
That's interesting.
If anybody wants to ask a question, they can unmute themselves.
Ben, do you want to? Hello, this is Peter Patrick. Can you hear him?
Hello, yes. Hi.
Hello there. Excellent show, and really appreciated it. But I'm just looking now at the building on the right-hand side of your 4 pictures there, where there was a lot of extensive refurbishment, I suppose you'd call it, perhaps rebuilding would be better. And I'm always interested in the way in which these buildings did change, much faster than once a century, as though every owner thought he just added his own signature. But when I look at this one on the right-hand side, it looks almost like a complete model building in itself, with a massive chimney warming the major side there. But did you find any evidence, as you got further understanding the construction of these 2 wings, did you get any further to work out what the thin extension, cross wing, call it what you want, what that would have been used for? I know you said an extra room and an extra bedroom, but if it was very thin, it wouldn't be useful for either of those things.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know what it was. It faces east, so maybe it was a chapel, but that who knows? I wish I did know. And maybe one day we'll work it out. But there are other buildings with sort of wings projecting off at the side. There's one at Coggeshall, the one with the best preserved shop. I think at the high end there's a wing at right angles. And Heybridge Hall had one added in the 17th century, which was a bit bigger, and that was evidently like a bedroom. But yes, I don't know quite what that was, unfortunately, but it's very interesting.
They seem as if they form separate contained flats or units for members of the family. That's what it seemed very much like Heybridge Hall. I don't know if Kevin came to any conclusion about that.
Yes, I think there was a granny annex, wasn't there, at Heybridge Hall? One, a widow was, because there was an inventory, wasn't it? He had, is Kevin here? He'll probably remember.
Kevin's around, isn't he?
And I think we thought that maybe that side wing may have been for accommodation for widow. But yeah, the one at Haybridge Hall was wider. It had better like a proper proportioned room by the look of it. But this one is quite odd because it's quite narrow, but not so narrow that it couldn't have been a bedroom. Could have had a trundle bed in there or something.
Was the Cold Norton house a manor house?
Pass. I should know that. I was meaning to look up. I don't know. I don't think it is, because I think I would remember if I'd noticed that it is.
It's very large.
It is.
On the first cross wing, sorry, Anne, you go on.
I was just going to suggest maybe the narrow projection. It's constrained on this side. I'm looking at the drawing by the chimneys, isn't it? Was there any other constraint on the other side?
I don't think so, unless
If they wanted to.
yeah, I think I was thinking. I don't know what the like whether there were windows on the flank of the old cross wing that prevented it from extending further that way. Unfortunately, I can't see. I couldn't. That part of the structure is concealed. Yeah, so I don't know. Can you still see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know whether there was any reason that they couldn't have gone a bit further that way.
It's right over the line.
Eccentric addition with those sort of curved braces. But yeah, I don't actually know where the original stairs were. But it doesn't look right for a stair tower. It looks too much, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think.
My first reaction when you showed it was that it was possibly a guardrobe tower, but the way the windows are in the front doesn't fit with that at all.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't think that was what it was.
On the first house, on the cross wing,
Yeah,
cross wing, you showed it divided into two rooms on the ground floor with a doorway between the entrance to the front.
Yeah.
It looks very much like a shop to me.
Yeah, it may well have been a shop. Unfortunately, it's right in the centre of the town, or just off the high street. Unfortunately, we can't reconstruct the front ground floor wall because it doesn't survive. But yeah.
You asked about the door at the back there. Haven't you got one of those in the high street in Maldon, in that public house that you did all the work on? I can't remember the name of it, where we were supposed to have one of our meetings.
The Swan?
Yeah, was it the Swan? That has the one with the very long cross wings on it, hasn't it?
Yeah.
That the high crosswing got a door like that at the back, where you can go upstairs from the yard.
The high-end crosswing has a two-story gallery structure, and there's a door somewhere around there that leads into the gallery thing. So yeah, I suppose that is comparable.
If it's a shop on the ground floor, it could have been separate accommodation on the first floor, rented out totally separate from anything else.
Yeah, so there's always a possibility, isn't it?
We don't know what's happening in the middle, really. How the open hall works.
No, unfortunately not.
How common is it in Essex to get the tie beam not over the cross beam, as in the back bay in this instance?
Sorry, what I didn't explain was this tie beam was not in that position. So in this room, there's this funny floating tie beam. It's about in this position. And I assumed that it had been moved because it was obviously not in that position originally. I assumed it had been moved to align with this pair of story posts. But as they opened up, there was no housing for the tie beam. In fact, there was a rafter housing. So I'm not sure where this tie-beam went, or whether it's about in this position here. It may have. I wonder if it was maybe in this sort of position and defined a stair bay in the middle, or maybe it just came from somewhere else entirely. I need to redo this drawing. I was going to explain that, but I thought it would take too long during the talk.
Okay, I have to answer the difficult question.
Yeah, trust you to notice that.
Probably a good point to wrap it up. There are enormous thanks to Tim, of course, but also to Jenny, who did a lot of the setting up for this in the first place, and rehearsals with you and things to make sure it worked. So thank you, both of you. I'm delighted to see that we had at least one cat join in, and I almost expected somebody to come in and say Norway 15 points at some point. But it's been a really good experience. Thanks everybody for joining in, and we'll send out notice of the next one. So I'll say goodbye to you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye everyone.
Bye, everyone.
very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio.
So that wasn't a very big attendance.
Okay.
30 people, which is great.
Jenny,
Finish my wine now.
Jenny, it went much better than the Norfolk one I watched yesterday.
Oh, good. It's not difficult. I thought Tim did really well. I mean, it was really good.
Yeah,
We're lucky to have him.
yeah, I agree with that.
We're lucky to have you as well.
I'm taking
And all the rest of you.
David, thank you very much for the help.
Videos. You're all disappearing one at a time. Goodbye, all.
Bye.
Bye.
And then there were 3.